No, I'm not related. Only the name is similar, but you have to know also that his name is actually misspelled in Western media. It's supposed to be ASAD,
Uh,
Assad, Assad, and not Assad. Assad is my name. Assad is his name,
I
and
see.
there's a big difference.
Okay, well, we're with Chris Assad,
Yes,
and he's in Canada now, and he was born in, did you say Aleppo?
yes.
Okay, and you've retired from the Canadian government, so you've obviously been there. I even hear a vague accent, so you've been there for a while.
Uh, 45 years, and my accent is intentional.
Okay, no, very good. And you've been you were working with the government. You're now a consultant, and you were interviewed at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning. Thanks, Chris, for coming here. I found you on social media, as I do many people, for Truth Seeker's Path. This is a Truth Seeker's Path. So you're a truth seeker. You've been walking on this path. I want to learn what this path is and help your story get out, because your story is important to everyone out there who can see a face to the truth movement. We're in the truth movement, whether you know it or not,
Sounds
because
good.
we're following the truth. So we're in that, we define the truth movement because we're following our truths. So where did it begin for you, Chris? It began, do you have any memories of being in Syria? Should we start there and then get to the 60s?
Well, of course, I was born in the 50s, and I had my primary education in Aleppo, uh, uh, and secondary education in Aleppo, and then I migrated basically to Europe first, and then to Canada. Um uh, Essentially, I was in Syria during the 1967 war, and in Europe during the 1973 war. And Syria during that time was essentially ruled by the Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, uh, which ostensibly kept on hanging on to power essentially until 2013, when the most recent elections were held, and other parties were allowed to join in the election campaign. So so we had a one-party rule essentially for the longest time in Syria during those years. And the Ba'ath Party used to be uh, uh, basically a very, very secular party, which appealed to a lot of Syrians, especially the young uh, Syrians who 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 basically grew up during that time, and and found out that you know pan-Arabism and socialism and Syria's policies are in accordance with their aspirations and their hopes for a better Arab future.
So there was a belief in the future at that time, and the party was representing that belief.
Precisely, precisely. And of course, the party banked on that quite heavily and ended up with huge numbers of membership. Rank and file swelled to the point where it became the largest party in political party in Syria. So it became a movement essentially. That kind of politics really did not jive well with Western regimes, to the point where, in my view, they targeted Syria for regime change even in those days, back in the early 60s. And I would dare to say even in the 50s, when Syria started arming its armed forces, the state armed forces, with Soviet weapons in those days in the early 50s. So it is from that time that I think Syria has been a target for the West, for the United States in particular.
Well, what you say makes sense, Chris, from the point of view of those of us who know less than you. You're adding a rich background of history and knowledge of politics here. But what of those of us who follow the truth of wars, we know that the Iranian government was overthrown in the 50s. So we
54.
know that meddling, 54.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know that meddling in the region was a top priority for the oil oligarchs way back then.
Indeed, and Syria, being a very, very important geographical hub, of course, the gateway to the Eastern Mediterranean, and consequently to Southern Europe and Europe in general. It's also, there's something about the topography of Syria, from the borders of Iraq all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean. Syria is actually on an incline of a few degrees, whereby the oil from the Gulf, from Iran and Iraq, etc., is easily transported through pipelines. Not much pumping is required, and that, of course, reduces the cost and makes it extremely appealing as a geostrategic location that is essentially the crown jewel for the oil oligarchs. So, having said that,
that's fascinating, by the way, Chris. Thank you. I had never heard that before. That's why there's many competing, but two major competing pipelines that preceded this war.
Precisely. And of course, I mean, I would hate to concentrate only on the pipelines because, of course, as the political situation evolved over the years, there was an introduction of other factors that complicated the whole issue of Syria and beyond. And that is, of course, goes without saying, the Israeli occupation in the area, which affects not only Syria, of course, but it affects also Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. And so the issues are intertwined, but I would again underline the importance of the pipelines, simply because even Israel now, having been assured of its existence, as a nuclear state in the area, as the only nuclear state in the area, is not really worried about its existence anymore, or is not even worried about being thrown into the sea. In fact, they are all friends with Israel, and they have pretty well extended full recognition back in 2002 in the Beirut summit, the Arab summit, and which Israel, of course, had rejected in order to keep the pot boiling and, of course, benefit from the so-called ineffective peace process, which was really theatrical and totally dishonest, being brokered by the United States. So this is, compacting a lot of information.
Yes, compacting of information, yes. We have also the Genie energy in the Golan Heights coming into play, and we have some gas fields off Gaza discovered as well. I don't know the how that is today, but apparently it was quite a lot at some point, and maybe it still is one of the factors playing into this as well. Oil, gas, politics, position. It's all the same. These power mad guys just never give up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So going back to the oil and gas issue, Tate, I do agree that it is probably the dominant question that has caused the so-called Syrian conflict. Fast forward to 2011 now. Of course, I was in Syria in 2009, and in 2009, Syria was undergoing an economic, evolution that was unseen in the urban centers. It was unseen before. There was a lot of prosperity, quite a bit. The life standard of people has improved. As you know, Syria was always affording its citizens free education, including higher education, free healthcare, the cheapest country in the Middle East in terms of food and housing, and everything was available. People were very, very happy.
Yes,
there was,
and women in positions of power, a secular society, an integrated society. We hear all about it now, but it's not from the media. It's not from the politicians.
Of course. But this is, I mean, there are, let's not exaggerate. Of course, the formal policy of the government is secularism, but the society itself, Tate, was not necessarily entirely secular.
No,
if you recall, back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, the Muslim Brotherhood conducted, of course, terror activities inside Syria, and attacked government troops and politicians of not only the government, but those that are allied with the government. And there were many progressive parties, the Arab Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the National Socialist, or the Syrian National Socialist Party, and even of course the Ba'ath Party, which was ruling in those days. So the Muslim Brotherhood in the 80s had a mini revolt that, of course, culminated in being called up in Hama, and of course we know about what happened then. They were eliminated militarily in Hama, with some heavy losses for their military branch. And we got peace in Syria in those days. Peace that lasted basically until now. 40 years later, the Islamic current re-emerged. So is Syria totally secular? No. We do have sectarianism in Syria that has been there, as I said, early 80s and probably even before that, okay? But they are a minority. They do not really have the support of the majority of the people. And consequently, of course, their policy and their crooked logic is based on confessionalism. And, they say, okay, because Syria is 70% Sunni, therefore the Sunnis should rule. It doesn't make sense. In Syria, we do not rule because, you cannot rule because you are a majority.
Yeah.
You rule because people elect you.
Yeah.
And that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. So we did have problems, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood still adopts this creed, this belief, is that because they are a majority, then they are supposed to be the rulers.
I see.
So this is one thing that Syrians have always rejected, and of course it culminated, of course, in what we see happened in 2011. But going back to 2009, when I was there, prior to 2009, I did notice, and everybody was talking about a drought in Syria. Now, Syria is basically an agricultural society to the tune of 45–50%, okay? And then we've got probably about 30–35–40% industrial and about 10–15% services. So, but the 50% agriculture, when you have a drought, then all the workers in the countryside migrates to the city where they want to get jobs. Well, the market at that time, the job market, could not sustain the huge numbers of people coming to the city because simply there weren't enough jobs suddenly to accommodate all these people. Especially, these people have no skills. Right. These are people, they know how to work the land. So we had a human development problem. We had an employment problem. And of course, this exasperated, that there was inflation because people were coming from there was no agricultural products coming to the cities. We had to start importing stuff, etc., etc. So there were some reason for people to complain.
Yeah.
Okay. And that came, of course, to the so-called spontaneous uprising that we saw.
We see so many of those spontaneous uprisings, Chris. Isn't it incredible? They come with plaques, they come with slogans, and they come with color revolution a lot of times. Their funding comes from George Soros or some other NGO. It's amazing how that happens.
Precisely. And this is what I want to tell you, is that those, if you recall, or if your listeners can recall, those spontaneous uprisings, even the president of Syria, Dr. Bashar al-Assad, had acknowledged that these uprisings were right. They do have a point, and we are going to be introducing a whole economic package to address these problems. And he did. And all of a sudden, the spontaneous uprisings disappeared. However, before those uprisings, that uprising disappeared, the color revolution started, and the snipers that were brought in from Turkey and from Jordan infiltrated those demonstrations in the cities, in Daraa, mainly, up on the Mediterranean coast in Banyas, where they started shooting at some army patrols, and so on and so forth. It's super easy to have 5 or 6 snipers in a small city like Daraa shooting at demonstrators, civilians, okay, and killing a few of the civilians and a few of the police, and in order to ignite what you call a civil war, which of course it was never a civil war, and I'll tell you why.
Yes.
I'll tell you why.
Could I just stop you just for a second, Chris? Tell us why. What happened? This is identical to what happened in Ukraine. Identical. Foreign snipers brought in, shoot both sides, inflame the problem, and declare that this horrible thing is happening. And who gets the blame? It's always whoever the globalists want to blame. Just
of course.
Pick the name. They already know the name. It's Putin. They already know the name. It's Assad.
Of course. So it's a classic solution for regime change. Okay, is to start it this way. If it worked in so many places before,
yes,
it should work in Syria, right?
Yes.
Well, the beauty is the Syrians addressed the issues And the Syrians made it clear to the overall population that, or they reminded the overall population that the demonstrations were being policed by policemen that did not have their weapons. Everybody noticed that the police that was present did not have weapons, and many of them were shot without being able to shoot back to defend themselves and get rid of the snipers. And the people went back home. Who replaced them? Hordes of terrorists, foreign terrorists, that were coming willy-nilly through the Jordanian border, Turkish border, and Lebanese border. Okay? Close to 300,000 people were actually transported into Syria that did not, of course, some of them are Arabs, probably about, I cannot really know numbers because not even the Syrian government or the American government knows that. But the Gulf countries would know how many they dispatched, okay? And I'm sure foreign countries such as the UK and the United States and France know who were allowed to leave those countries to join the terrorists, the terrorists in Syria. So the point is, most of these people were terrorists that are foreign. We had the Uyghurs, they brought them all the way from China. We've got Uzbeks, we've got Pakistanis, Bengalis, everywhere.
90 countries represented in Syria from foreign lands, coming there as mercenaries and funded by, well, I don't know who exactly, but John McCain was out there giving $500 million to the rebel uprising to help the poor Syrian government overthrow Assad, which they wanted to do to get the oil. So it's always the same.
Precisely. So here we have it. We had a war that started against the state army, and with the objective, of course, of toppling the Assad government. The war, of course, went through a lot of iterations. It had because first it was, we're not going to be dividing Syria. We're going to only topple the government, and we're going to have a democratic, free government sitting in Damascus. Then, no, we need to divide Syria. Then we need to divide it on sectarian grounds. Then we have to create a Kurdish state. Then, we have to get rid of ISIL, and so on and so forth. So the many iterations essentially are attempts and re-attempts of achieving one objective, and that is breaking up Syria by toppling the regime that holds it together and taking it over and plundering, doing the exact pillaging and the destruction that they are doing in Libya. Okay, so for them that is a perfect model. Let the people fight among each other. We take care of the oil and the resources, and nobody will touch us.
Divide and conquer. That's order out of chaos. It comes straight from the handbook of the globalists, and they did the same thing in Iraq. They had these iterations. First, it was about going and getting rid of Saddam. Then it was about finding those WMDs. Then it was about stopping Al-Qaeda at the time. And then it was about, well, we can't leave. So this is iterations about why the U.S. is in Iraq stealing oil. At the final one, they said, well, we can't leave. That would leave a power vacuum, and there would be more deaths than what they've already caused. It just becomes silly when you start stringing it all together. The dumbed-down American public, that is probably the only category of people still fooled by this mainstream media in any large numbers, they bought that story that, well, if we don't leave, each one of these iterations makes sense to them. But most of us who are looking at this problems and seeing the patterns, we see, well, wait a minute, you're doing the same things, and the same beneficiaries are getting the money and having the power, and they're the same ones pushing the lies to make it happen. So it is very frustrating, Chris, and I really like you wrapping this up because you're tying so many things together.
Thank you. You know, Tate, the big crime is the dumbing down of the United States population. Okay, these people are so irresponsible that they do not even care to say the truth to their own people. Okay, in order to achieve their political and military agendas, it's a policy of hegemony. It's a policy of domination that even their own people, you know, are being denied the truth simply because, of course, Congress people will have to write blank checks all the time to the military-industrial complex, okay? No questions asked. This is the problem. You know, you've got health issues, you've got, you know, higher education is now an elitist club domain, you know, housing, etc., etc. Listen, a superpower, a great power like the United States, you know, not being able to afford a better life standard to millions of people is a disgrace. It's a disgrace. Yet they go and spend trillions of dollars on wars since the 1980s until this day, never-ending wars.
The military-industrial complex has found a way to dominate political, and what they've done is they found an easy way to start wars in a very cheap way, as you pointed out. This method's been used over and over again. There's many methods. There's a book written by a Russian called the book is called Hybrid Wars, and Hybrid Wars is about, you've heard of that. Hybrid Wars
Yes.
is all of the different ways, using information, using media, using deception, using rebel groups, using these assassination type things, that crashing the currency, everything. It's hybrid wars, and they're consuming the planet. Military-industrial complex has a goal, and it's the same goal that every crazy person wants in every cartoon, in every major Hollywood film, and in history. The Caesars, all of it says the same thing. Even in our myths, dominate the world. These guys are crazy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you know, as long as we have such a policy, it is really necessary for people in the United States and in the world to be aware on what best methods to oppose it and try to bring reason, you know, to these people, because, you know, what I'm seeing now is that they are willing to go to war. For example, the Democrats and the opposition in the United States are willing to go to war in order to stop Trump from getting anything meaningful towards peace arranged with the Russians.
No, that's exactly right. They're willing to risk nuclear war with the only other nuclear triad country on the planet, the only one that can launch missiles and destroy the planet from air, sea, and ground, because they don't like Trump, because they want a few more votes, because they want to retain power. It's crazy.
Yeah, this is not in defense of Trump. Okay,
no.
He's another oligarch. Okay,
yeah.
My issue as a citizen, okay, as a citizen of the world, is that, listen, if this president of yours, which was elected, okay, as president, wants to improve relations peacefully, you ought to allow that. Otherwise, you guys are warmongers, and warmongers are not acceptable anymore. That's why we have people like Russia, people like Putin, announcing in April that they've got 5 new weapons that cannot be defeated, thus creating a balance with the war party in the United States. Is that, guys, don't think that your policy is going to be okay to continue with. Think of the consequences, okay? And I'm fully behind Putin to announce that publicly to the world, so that he can put those people to shame in case they do not reconsider their policies. I hope they do, and I think they will, because, hey, listen, a rich man does not want to lose his source of income, okay? They are after the money, and they are after power, and they know that a nuclear war is a mutually destructive thing, and they're not going to go for nuclear war, and of course the Russians won't, and they think they want to hang on to the status quo, and they want to propagate and prop that up until thy kingdom come. It's not going to work. The world has changed. We've got now two poles. We've got the Russians coming back, after 25 years of deep sleep, and we've got the Americans still the dominant superpower. We respect both superpowers, but we want to see some responsible political behavior from each. And we don't see it from the United States so far, except from the president, and one hand cannot clap. We need the Congress to be behind him, and until now, the Congress is not behind him.
Very well said, Chris. Good synopsis. And I like what you said at the in there. You said this is not an endorsement of Trump. He's an oligarch. Absolutely. And how simple and stupid the argument is. If you say something in support of an action of a person, then they say, "Oh, you're Putin's robot." I mean, how do you get from A to B? These guys have no math skills. It's like 1 + 1 is not equal 456. Come on, guys.
Well, I call it silly and dangerous at the same time, because this Russophobia is really something that Obama has started, and he laid it right into Trump's lap so that Trump can have his own so-called troubles if he wins the election. And he did, and he is having the troubles. It is all the Democrats make. This is designed to really create a roadblock, okay, for detente between Russia and the United States. No, and this only serves the purposes of the war party.
I agree. And I'd go a step further, Chris, and say that my own cynical view is that both parties are dominated by this exact same force. One is the right hand, one is the left hand. They're both sides of the two sides of the same coin. But Trump is an independent person. You may not like him, you may not agree with him, but he doesn't just do whatever the deep state wants. And so he is not controllable. So he's got to get out of there. Who is controllable? Hillary, Obama, everyone else except a very few people. Ron Paul is an exception. He's one of the few exceptions. Everyone else talks a good story. Who was anti-war before being elected? Everyone. And who's making war after the election? Everyone. End of story. Correct. That's from my point of view.
Correct. I agree with that, Tate. So back to Syria, which is really the focal point of the dynamic situation that we saw evolving over the past 7 to 8 years between the United States and Russia, and how things are now panning out, especially after Trump's visit with Putin in Helsinki. So from what I can gather is that the Americans simply found out that there are no reliable partners in Syria they can depend on any longer to maintain and sustain their illegal presence. Okay? So of course they are going to say to the Russians, okay, we are staying in Syria unless you give us something, okay? And the Russians said, well, we've got nothing to give you. It's the Syrians that need to give you or not give you. You've got to talk to them. They have invited Iran. I cannot give you, and I cannot go and tell to Iran to pull their advisors, etc., etc. It's not my land. It's not my country. I was invited just like Iran was. Trump wants Iran out of Syria. This is something that you do not ask neither the Iranians nor the Russians. You have got to ask it of the Syrians. And the Syrians have already indicated in very, very clear words prior to the summit in Helsinki that they will only tell the Iranians to leave when they feel they are not required any longer. And that is a sovereign decision that nobody, no Russia, no Israel, no the United States, and no Iran can do anything about. Okay? So having said that, I want to say that the Iranian advisors, and there were, by the way, there are no troops, okay? There are advisors that live and work as part of the regular state army. They do not have bases, okay? They are inside the Syrian regular state army. Number one. Number two, they have been there before 2011, long before, okay? Now, I don't know when the military cooperation started, but I have good information to indicate that it started in the late 1990s, just prior to the 2000 booting out of Israel from southern Lebanon, okay, by Hezbollah, okay? So this has been going on for 18 years, not only in the last 7. Of course, their numbers have increased in Syria since the conflict started in 2011. How many? I don't know, but I would think, given the fact that prior to 1979 or 1980, Syria had over 15,000 Russian advisors. Okay, those numbers started going down gradually until such time that when the Soviet Union dissolved back in 1992, there were very, very few left. Of course, we know that the president of Syria issued a formal invitation to the Russians in 2015 and got, a whole bunch of Russians to help with the war on terror in Syria.
Yes.
So when we talk about 10, 15,000, I imagine it's about the same number for the Iranian advisors that are currently in Syria, if people want to know. Now, these people have been invited, formally invited by the Syrian government for military cooperation because there are treaties between the Syrians and the Iranian government. Okay?
Well, they're neighbors, so it would make sense.
Well, there's Iraq in between. Okay, they are not exactly neighbors, but there's Iraq in between geographically. But they are a regional power, okay, that did no harm to nobody. They didn't attack anybody. They were attacked by Saddam Hussein after the Americans nudged him to do so. Okay, so Saddam Hussein was a great friend of the United States. He created the Iraqi-Iranian war. Which is in line with American policy in the Middle East. Keep those weapons, going, right?
The weapons going, keep the conflicts going, keep people distracted, and let that oil keep going towards the oil oligarchs.
Precisely, and so on and so forth. But so having said that, okay, the Iranian issue is not, the Iranian advisors should not be an impediment to any political settlement, that I can see coming between Syria and Israel, and between Syria and Turkey, and between Syria and itself. Okay, the war is being wrapped up. in my view, it is the 11th hour before, the final victory is announced.
Beautiful.
Okay? We have only Idlib that remains, and then of course there is that other war that Syria will have to fight, and that is the refugees. The refugees are a huge problem for Syria. We need those people to come back. The Syrian leadership invited them to come back. The problem is that they are not being allowed to come back. They are being used, to hamper not only a political settlement, but to hamper the rebuilding of Syria.
They're not allowed to come back by whom? Sorry, Chris.
Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. They would rather keep those guys and make money, in terms of aid, from whether it's from the United Nations or from donor countries,
yes, right.
in Europe and in America. And if anybody who wants to come back, if you have money, you can come back. And the Syrians gave their word that nobody will be harassed. Everybody comes back to their homes. Now, if their home is standing, but if they don't have if they don't have a place to go, you need money, you need organization, you need an international effort that will build at least, some of these infrastructure and some of these housing projects, etc., that would allow a decent number to come back and live there. So the refugee issue is being played against the rebuilding of Syria and against a political settlement. So hopefully that will be resolved. Trump and Putin did speak about the refugee issue in their summit, and they said that they are going to be working hard together in order to bring the refugees and settle them back in their own country. Idlib, where there are probably 100,000.
Could I just talk about that refugee thing, Chris? Wouldn't it be unprecedented, just about the comment that you made, that hopefully there will be a development between Trump, Putin, UN, other local states that would support the refugees coming back into Syria, whether they have homes or not, to find work, to rebuild, because the rebuilding is so important. But it would be, let's admit, Chris, it would be unprecedented for the big powers that control the purse strings of money to rebuild on a large scale a country that they destroyed. Would that be a correct statement?
Well, it would be the right thing to do.
Absolutely, I agree.
But there is an issue, Tate. The president, not very long ago, the president of Syria, Dr. Al-Assad, gave, I believe it was NTV, the Russian TV station, an interview in which he, and I quote, he said, "We did not use anybody's money to build Syria, and we will not accept anybody's money to rebuild it now." So in other words, he is not really interested in money. Now, maybe this is not really a totally pragmatic stance. It is. I firmly believe that money is going to be required. After 8 years of a debilitating war. Now, of course, Syria can say, it'll be our money, give us loans, and we will work based on that. So that is another way of achieving the president's objective of not taking money for free. He wants to build to build Syria with Syrian money and Syrian labor. And of course, the technical help is going to be coming from Russia mainly, and from Iran, and from the friendly countries that did not have any belligerent activity against the Syrians for the Syrian army. Having said that, that takes out a lot of the Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, all this capital that is going to be sitting, let them send it to Chase Manhattan and Citibank and all these guys. That's fine. We simply are not interested in their money, okay? And I just heard 2 days ago, for the first time in Syrian history, the Syrian government decided that each foreigner must report to the closest police station to identify himself and show his visa. Anybody without a visa will be deported. Meaning, and maybe you don't know this, but the Syrian government have always allowed from Arab countries a free entry, no visa required, into Syria, to the point where, for example, when we had the Somali crisis, Somalis would come to Syria, benefit from the healthcare, free education for their kids, while the husbands are gone to Saudi Arabia to work, okay, and make money.
No, I didn't know that.
Well, there you go. So Syria was extremely generous to all these Arabs, but the Islamization of the Wahhabis of the Arab world, okay, actually did not reward Syria in any good way. They went and they waged war against Syria and destroyed Syria, and this is what really hurts, okay? So Syria will be rebuilt without their money. We do not want them there unless they are there for legal purposes and not for terrorism.
Wonderful wrap up, Chris. That's I hope that comes true. Now you've got great sources. You're from Syria originally. You have eloquent English, if I might say, and your depth of knowledge is fantastic. You were also on the news. Could you go into a little bit about what you did for the news, and then also what sources do you use? Do you have friends on the ground that have connections to the government in Syria, or do you just follow the alternative news, or that maybe in Syria it would be the government news plus on the ground reporting?
Yes, I have. Of course, I have my cousins are still in Syria. I've got cousins in the north. I've got cousins in the Kalamoon Mountains. Some of them are professors at the university. Some of them are engineers and doctors in other cities. And I do receive, just like, because I'm a family member, I receive Skype, Facebook chats, Google, WhatsApp, almost every day. And I do hear reports from them. I also have very good friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where I ask them about things and they respond. I want to confirm certain things, the veracity of certain news. They do respond. So I get information from the official Syria, and I get information from the layman and the regular citizen of the country. And as far as, and of course, alternative news is the only way to go. I do respect certain official channels, but I do consider those as well as alternative news, RT, to me. Although it's official, it's all over the world, it's on the internet, but I think it's also an alternative channel because they do touch on issues that other state channels do not really give any fair treatment to. So having said that, in Canada, I recall, for example, one radio interview, not so much TV interviews. TV interviews went famously well. It's the radio interviews because they are live. Okay, I obviously I had pissed off somebody, and I told them, like, hey, you know, if we here in Canada see people running around with guns, shooting private and public property, and looting and putting things on fire, what do you think the Canadians are going to do? You know what? Do you think the army is going to go and run into their barracks? It's not going to happen. You know, here we get one guy with a gun, not even shooting, and we get about 10 million goddamn policemen all over him. Yeah. You know, I mean, excuse me, but you know, when you have a bunch of terrorists that are well trained, okay, whether in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, coming to your country and pillaging and killing everyone and terrorizing the citizens, going into residential area, and you know, the government sitting there twiddling their thumbs. What do? Do we kill all these civilians? Well, no. You know, in military, you open any military operations book, okay? The technical term is, and that is, of course, standard throughout the whole world. Every army does it. If the source of fire is coming from point A, then if you have to respond, you respond, no consideration given to what is there in point A. You bring down the whole bloody building. That's what happens here. You know, so you get citizens or civilians as collateral damage, fine. But if you don't, there will be more citizens and more civilians getting killed. Yeah. And the Syrians, of course, at the beginning of the crisis, the orders were not to shoot on civilian on citizens' residences. And that's where the terrorists were. And that's why it took so long to get rid of the bloody people, you know, that were attacking the Syrians. And many army officers and many army personnel actually perished because they were sitting ducks. You know, the terrorists were taking advantage of their position in those
civilian places. Yeah,
exactly. They were using the civilians as a shield, yeah. And that was a huge problem for the Syrian government.
No, that's amazing. That's very sad to see that happen. It's almost too easy to overthrow a country now. You just throw in a handful of foreign mercenaries who will do anything to the society. The Syrian people, no regular citizen could be trained to do what those foreign mercenaries are doing in Syria. It's always going to be a foreign mercenary occupation power that does that sort of thing.
Yeah, as I said, yeah, you're right. You're right. Absolutely. Because, you know, they relied on foreign mercenaries principally because they really do not have too many Syrians that are opposed to the government line. The government is, I mean, the 2014 presidential election, President Assad ended up with something like 86 or 87% of the vote. You know, now that is significant. That is as high as any Western democracy's result. You know, and maybe better. But the thing is, it's easy for a lot of these Western leaders to discount and dismiss the legality of the vote. They will tell you, well, this is not, come on, it's a warlike atmosphere. How the hell can people vote? Well, people voted. 16 million people. We have 16 million voters out of 24 million. 12 million out of the 16 voted. Yeah. And what do you want?
That radio interview that you had where this guy got upset with you, so he was scripted to believe that the Syrian army was doing crazy things to its own people all of a sudden, when you know, just because of this so-called uprising. And when you brought up the idea of fighting these foreign terrorists, there was a disconnect because he didn't understand that there were foreign terrorists, I suppose. Is that correct?
He believed it was a real revolution. And actually, it wasn't he; it was a she. Okay. And I'm not going to name names, but she said essentially This is a revolution. This is a people rejecting the status quo, and they want to get rid of Assad. That was, of course, the rebels' narrative. I said, this is no revolution. These are gangs. 80% of the bloody people are foreign. They don't even speak the language.
Yeah.
They don't understand the colloquial dialect. They are from all over the place. How can you have a revolution? How can you have a civil war? A civil war, by definition, is when you have people of the same country going and fighting each other, say 40-60 or 50-50 or something of that nature. But when you have a minority that is guiding, you know, they are acting as guides to 80% of these mercenaries, you know. So the political forces in Syria that are, and you'll always have people opposed to the regime, by the way, in any country. But in Syria, we're talking about 10% maybe of the political spectrum. 10% of the adults that are politicized probably are Islamist. Okay, 90% of the people do not want. They are Sufis. They are very, very peaceful people. They do not want any violence, and they are fine with secularism. You know, because secularism was there for 40 years, since 1963, when the Ba'ath Party took power.
Chris, you're very eloquent. You know history better than anyone that I have spoken to about Syria anyway. And it certainly ties in with the history of war in all these countries. There's so many links. Could you tell us, please, when your wake-up happened? I think I'm going to know the answer. I'm not sure if you ever really had to wake up. Maybe you were born in this sort of truth that we're talking about now. But I just have to ask, when did you see the disconnect between what the Western media promotes as the truth, which is nearly identical, but it's all identically wrong, versus what is really going on, which is mainly grabbed by a lot of alternative media, and they generally agree on the same truth that actually exists. So we have the lie that agrees, the big money that present it, and we have the truth that agrees, and it's passionate people like you and I who dig for ourselves, or maybe like you live there, and we agree as well because we know what's going on. And this disconnect is just big powers versus truth. This is elite control maniacs who have co-opted the minds of a lot of people with false patriotism. And here we have some people who leak through the system more and more now, leaking through, and they're discovering, hey, wait a minute. If this isn't true and this isn't true, maybe I'll study more. And the more we study, the more we study, the more we see, the more we learn. Then we draw links in history with other wars. Well, wait a minute, I see a pattern. Okay, the world is run by psychopathic maniacs. I get it. What do we do now?
Okay. Very simply, I want to state on the air now, for the first 2 or 3 months, my position vis-a-vis the conflict was not so favorable to the government and to the state army. I was essentially very critical of the situation and the way it was being handled, simply because I kind of analyzed on my own, without real information, is that if it wasn't for the government mistakes over so many years, we wouldn't have ended up with this result. The wake-up call came when I started connecting with my relatives in the city of Aleppo, where initially during that war, certain residential neighborhoods, theirs included, was being bombarded by rebel forces that were claiming that the Assad regime was bombing civilians. And there was a couple of hospitals, huge, fantastic hospitals, very modern, that were destroyed. One of them was El Kindi. Now, when I I managed to connect with my cousins in Aleppo, and I asked, you guys, can you please give me the reality, give me a picture? And they told me what's happening. I said, the government line, I'm sorry, the government line is the truth. And these rebels are nobody except terrorists. And the Western media is supporting that, and they are giving us a 180% different picture about what is happening in Syria. And then I started noticing that in every news item about Syria, the Western media insisted on the narrative, Assad is killing his own people, which of course made me furious, because I know from the ground, from people that are living there, that Assad was actually protecting the people.
Very good story. What year was that?
2012. 2011 in October.
Okay, so this is quite an interesting, different thing. Normally, what I'll find with most of my interviews is there was a moment or a process where people would wake up to the media, but you already knew that, you already had known, you've been following the wars for quite a while. You said since the 60s, you were born in the 50s, you've been already following the wars even in the 60s. So you had some sense of being an anti-war person, and you had some sense that governments were behind that, big money government. Is that more or less true? Or
it's very true when it comes to Syria's foreign policy and the overall Middle East picture. Not, talking about the Syrian conflict. That the wake up call actually was in 2011. But in terms of my overall political antennas, being oriented to the proper destination.
Yes.
That was, when I was about 16, 17, 18, shortly before the 1967 Israeli-Arab War.
Okay. So you've had phases, and now I think you're in the final phase where you see the total big picture. And maybe this has also been, to be fair, perhaps this has also been evolving as the total picture. Maybe these big powers have only now become so dominant and become so obvious because their crimes are so big, they can't cover it up. The only thing they can do to cover up the crimes now is to make another lie that's even bigger and keep going. But that's not going to end very well for any of us.
I just hope not. I just hope that the Russians have proven that Syria is not for the taking, and they respect, as they have also shown, they respect the Syrian decision, the Syrian sovereignty, and they want international law to be the dominant factor in that region, to be applied, okay? And that applies to the Israeli-Arab conflict. It applies to, of course, the Syrian conflict. It applies to Turkey and Idlib issues. It applies to the United States in the east part, where the United States is really eager to put their hands on the oil wells, something that they do not need. And I think Trump is ready to give that back to the Syrians. And of course, I wouldn't say throw the Kurds under the bus, but knowing that the Kurds really have no choice but to go back to the Syrian government, because the Syrians have promised them a fair deal enshrined in the new constitution that the Syrians are about to produce. So, having said all this, okay, I think the Syrian war surely should be the very last episode in the misery that the Syrian people had undergone for the past 7 or 8 years.
Thank you, Chris. That's wonderful. I hope you're right. And that would mark the end of all these resource wars. If we could stop, if this truth comes out big enough and the awareness brings an end, to the Syrian war, it very well could stop other wars. Because, and on the other side, if our truth doesn't get out big enough, and if the war continues, there are a number of countries that are next on the list. This doesn't stop with Syria any more than it should have stopped with Libya or Iraq, or going all the way back. It's just the game of big powers, and unfortunately, we're in the position of waking up dumbed down people so that an opinion can be big enough to have enough political pressure to exert, which is bigger than the money pressure, and stop these sorts of wars.
Yeah, I agree, and I know exactly what you mean. I mean, but you know, let's put you know, let's put it on the table. Iran, of course, is probably an objective, a target.
Yes.
But it is Iran is fortunately for the Iranians is a much bigger fish to fry. I don't think the oil oligarchs would be able to do in Iran what they did in Syria. Okay, Syria was taken by surprise. It was taken aback because of the involvement of different Arab countries that are bordering Syria, porous borders, 900 kilometers borders between Turkey and Syria, which was also porous because most of the Syrian armed forces are really on the borders with Israel in the south. So they have taken advantage of all these issues. They have taken advantage of the peaceful demonstrations that we had. They have taken advantage of the drought and the economic situation, etc., etc. And they failed. Okay, thanks to Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and of course, first and foremost, to the valiant Syrian Arab army. Okay,
absolutely,
which will liberate. As the president had promised, each and every centimeter of Syrian soil, and mark my words.
Very good. What do people think of, just quickly, thank you for your time, Chris. You've been so generous with it, and it's much deeper and more detailed than I had imagined. The best interview I've heard so far on the history of Syria leading up to this war, and the involvement of those forces that make this war happen comes from you, sir. Thank you. And we also got a picture into your own evolution as a human being in the process. So thank you again, sir. Chris, what do people believe? What do they think about Russia in Syria today?
Well, traditionally, the people thought they had friendly thoughts about Russia. For them, Russia is a natural friend, which have good relations for more than half a century with the Syrians. And there are cross sections of the Syrian society, you know, the Christians of Syria, which at one point numbered a very, very sizable minority. We're talking about, at one point, there were about 20, well, at one point was the whole country was Christian, but at one point, say in the 50s, when I was born, there were approximately 50% of the people were Christian, because we were about 4 million people and 2 million Christians. The Christians have a very, very special relationship with Russia because they consider Russians protectors of minorities, especially the Christian minority in Syria. And I hear a lot, okay, maybe not from official circles, but I hear a lot of Christian people, and I'm not very religious by any means, you know. I'm a secular humanist, and I'm happy with that. But I hear a lot of Christian believers, that if it wasn't for the Russians, these terror gangs would have slaughtered whatever Christians and Alawis and Druze that were left supporting the government in Syria until now. Okay, there would be none of those minorities, and you probably heard about the massacres that took place in many Alawi villages. The two villages, Kefraya and Fua, only today were evacuated after 3 years of siege by Ahrar al-Sham, al-Nusra, and al-Qaeda, basically gangs in Idlib, in northern Idlib. Okay, and they were evacuated today after 3 years, and they lost a lot of people. Okay, but they withstood the siege for 3 years. They withstood all the mortars, all the artillery, all the missiles that were going against them for 3 years. These people I respect, and they are the microcosm of all of Syria. Great that they withstood and persevered for 7 or 8 years. I really salute the Syrian people.
So many people who go to Syria say exactly the same thing, Chris. People who know and study, they say the same thing. The Syrians must be the most awake people on the planet right now, as far as understanding what's going on in terms of the forces at work. What are the Russian forces to them? Okay, there's always going to be some generalities whenever you make statements like that, but the generality of the U.S. is very negative on Syria. The generality of the UN and NATO, very negative on Syria, and each of these war targets. And Russia has, maybe it's not only altruistic, Chris. It's possible that they're heading off the war coming in their direction because, like you said about Iran, Russia is also very strong and able to defend itself. And nothing like some of these smaller countries that are picked off and ganged up on by these big oligarch Westerners with their big money and big guns that if they don't get rid of these bombs, they're going to expire anyway. So the most profitable thing to do with these bombs, unfortunately, in their Machiavellian context, is to bomb civilians, create chaos, turn a cost into a profit, because then you get the spoils of war. So this is the kind of mentality that these demons dream up in their boardrooms and their I don't know, their secret cults or whatever they belong to. But we're setting up a different planet, Chris. Thanks for being part of that movement, our awareness, and getting the truth out and talking to each other and owning this free internet is very important, because I would never learn so much if I didn't own, dominate my little area of this. And I like to see people like you out there. Where can people get in touch with you, Chris? Do you have a passion to post things, or do you like to just periodically, do you like to maybe to relax most of the time and enjoy your retirement that's well earned there in Canada, which is having a beautiful summer right now?
Yes, indeed. Yes. Well, I mean, I'm on Facebook as Chris Assad. And I do have some nice followers that interact with me, and I interact with. So aside from that, really, I only respond to interviews like yours. I did decline one interview from the CBC here in Canada about a couple of months ago. I found it in me to actually decline that because I feel confident that the truth ultimately is going to show on the ground in Syria with the defeat of the terrorists and the defeat of ISIL on the hands of the Syrian and Russian armies. And as I said, I cannot agree more with your assessment of Russia's interest, not only in protecting the legality and the international law in Syria, but protecting Syria, and protecting Russia itself, because these Islamic terrorists would have been knocking on Moscow's doors if Syria is broken.
Absolutely.
And the same goes for Iran. These Wahhabis would end up also in Iran. So these two countries, you know, although they have different agendas and different orientations, but they are good friends. And because they are good friends, Syria became, you know, a focus point for them, so that they can help Syria get rid of these terrorists. And they succeeded, and good for all of them. Good for all of them. It's very important that the scourge of extremism, especially if it is based on religious dogma, must be stopped. Must be stopped, because religion cannot and should not be used as a tool for killing people and murdering countries, regime change, or any things of that sort. So there you have it.
Absolutely. I'd like to just add one thing that I never talked about on video that I remember, but I've done many posts about. People have the false idea that it's people from these countries, like Syrians and other countries, that immigrate into Europe and that are causing all these rapes and problems. But I suspect, because there's so much evidence showing that it's the mercenaries that go from Syria and they drop their passport and they get entered into Europe, and they present themselves as Syrians. They're not vetted, they're not verified, there's no background checks. They come in there and they do what they always do. So whereas I'm not saying every person coming from Syria has never committed a crime in Europe. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, when you have a huge influx of people coming from a war zone, and when that war zone is being fomented and created by foreign mercenaries, and when there's no checks in Europe for those foreign mercenaries, and then there's a lot of problems in Europe, everyone's saying, oh, well, look what's happening. We're getting people from Arab countries that are coming to create problems in Europe now. And of course, it's part of the war. There's a bit of guilt there from the people. They're finally waking up to that. But the blame still comes, oh, these people from Syria. No, it's not predominantly that effect. It's predominantly the effect of when you create a war with foreign mercenaries, and when there's a massive migration, you're going to get financial opportunists that come into the safety net of Europe and continue doing what you trained them to do.
I cannot agree more. That reminds me of a little joke. In a refugee camp in Lebanon, one of the people that wanted to immigrate to Canada as a refugee was actually a black person, a pitch black. Okay, so when they spoke to him, and I heard that from people who arrived here as refugees. I helped, by the way, I helped in that regard in the, you know, the advent of refugees to Canada on the government side, of course. But the thing is, when they spoke to him in Arabic, he barely spoke the Syrian dialect. The guy was an African. And further investigations showed that his passport, a Syrian passport, was bought on the black market for $10. So,
right. There you go.
So having said that, okay, you know, joking aside, okay, the push to cut the diplomatic relations with the Syrian government at the start of the conflict from all the NATO countries, essentially all the countries, including the countries of the Arab world. You know, you realize that Syria was kicked out from the Arab League. Okay, so they don't have a seat there anymore. Okay, and they were a country that one of the original establishers of the Arab League. Anyways, they were kicked out. But when you don't have diplomatic relations with a country, you cannot, send that country a memorandum asking them to verify passport numbers or identities of people. Okay,
right.
And they cannot, of course, respond to you. These passports are valid, or these passports were issued by us. So such relationship was severed right 2 or 3 months after the conflict started. Okay, that was a purposeful, policy to ready Syria for a foreign mercenary war of terror against it. Okay, so basically all these foreigners would have a back door back into where they came from, to Europe. Okay, and that's what President Assad had warned against the Europeans right from the start, telling them, you guys sending us terrorists is going to backfire on you, and you're going to have terrorism. Okay, so having said that, okay, you are absolutely right in your analysis about the refugees being mostly, bogus Syrians that are essentially Islamic extremists. They are sex-starved, okay? They have absolutely no morals. They are there for money, for survival, because they have no skills except to kill and behead people. That's their creed. That's their religion, okay? Quote unquote. So having said that, okay, the ones that immigrated into Europe with their proper Syrian passport are not economic migrants. They are the ones that escape areas where the violence have reached levels that cannot be tolerated by a citizen who is, he's a civilian, no food, everything is closed, and the bombs are raining on you, so you migrate. And that's exactly who they are. They, percentage-wise, I would say about 25% are good legal Syrians, good migrants, and 75%, especially in Western Europe, 75% of the people are shady, to say the least.
Chris, it's been fantastic talking with you. I've really held you over, and you know what? I think you're so. If I could go on and on. I have a lot of other questions that we could discuss. I'm sure we agree on all of the major issues, and I would continue to learn a lot more from you. Let's just leave it like this. Is there anything else you'd like to say? And would you welcome other people to contact you if the conditions were correct? Do you enjoy this? Do you enjoy disseminating your knowledge in this way?
Well, this is the only way really that I can talk to you, and hopefully you will be able to reach some, larger audience. But I do, as I said, I'm active on Facebook in particular, and every now and then I come up with some thoughts that people like you would catch on and find interesting. So I personally do not think that I know everything, the ins and outs of every little detail, but I can, as a Syrian citizen, tell you that I have enough information, as I should, to be able to see where Syria is going, and for that I'm very, very thankful for the Syrian officials that help out, and for my relatives who refused to leave Syria despite all the odds.
Thank you, Chris. Your testimony is fantastic, and your education is equally fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing.
You are welcome, Tate. It'll be nice if we can talk again.
Okay.